Welcome back to the last round of our lecture series for Chapter 19 in your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is simply titled 1919. The focus question for this section is, why was the year 1919 such a watershed year for the United States and the world? The Communist Russian Revolution, led by Vladimir Lenin, as well as the democratic aspirations of much of the rhetoric that surrounded World War I, particularly from Woodrow Wilson, sent feelings of both hope and fear throughout the world. Both communism and Wilson's idea of self-determination in particular inspired hope for some, but signaled danger to others. And the year 1919 was marked by worldwide social and political upheaval as these two ideas spread around the globe and peoples began to think about them and what they meant and how they might be used to their advantage. There was both a mobilization of the proponents of radical change, both in the ideas of communism and self-determination, sometimes both at the same time. But for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And these proponents and these movements for radical change were met with a equally forceful conservative attempt to quell those changes and maintain the status quo. One of the first manifestations of this pushback against radical change, particularly surrounding communism, was Western powers' military intervention in the Soviet Union during the Russian Revolution. The United States, Great Britain, France, and several other Western powers sent troops into Russia on the side of the anti-communist forces to try to quell the communist movement within Russia. And anti-communism would remain a pillar of 20th century American foreign policy. We must ask the question, why was communism feared by so many? The idea of communism had been around since 1848, when a gentleman by the name of Karl Marx first published the Communist Manifesto. And Marx developed his idea of communism as an alternative to capitalism, which Marx viewed as exploiting the many to enrich the few. But up until the Russian Revolution, the idea of communism had really been mostly confined to intellectual and academic circles. The Russian Revolution and the creation of the Soviet Union was the first time Marx's philosophy was ever put into practice. And for starters, the civil war in Russia between pro and anti-communists inspired fear that similar attempts to impose communism could create more conflict and destabilize the fragile peace after World War I. But even greater than that, the tenets of communism were diametrically opposed to Western economic and political thought. Western economic and political thought was all about the right to private property, and the government's essential role was to protect that right. Communism, on the other hand, sought to completely abolish private property. All property would be owned by the government, completely opposite from the economic and political philosophy of Western capitalism at the time. We also must ask the question, why would many Americans be opposed to communism? After all, socialism, which essentially can be deemed somewhat communism light, if you will, as the two ideas share many of the same core philosophies, had been a part of American political thought and discourse for decades up to that point. Many progressive-era policies and proposals had many socialist tendencies, and the Socialist Party itself in the United States as it was at its peak popularity prior to World War I. But the fundamental difference was that under socialism, it called for the government direction and regulation of the economy, but it maintained the right to private ownership. Communism, on the other hand, as we discussed in the previous slide, called for the complete government ownership of all property and complete government control of the economy. American and European property owners and business leaders could begrudgingly work with many socialist ideas and ideals, as at least their fundamental right to property was maintained. But communism infringed too much on that right and threatened their very well-being in their minds at the time. After the Russian Revolution, many Americans came to see little distinction between socialists and communists. They were essentially, in many Americans' eyes, two sides of the same coin and just as dangerous to a stable society, stable government, and a stable economy. One final question we must ask was, why was self-determination feared by many? After all, it was one of the central planks of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Wilson's idea of self-determination became a rallying cry for colonial peoples seeking to break free from European rule and establish their own nation-states. European powers, of course, did not want to lose control of their colonies. They were too lucrative and too enmeshed in the European economy. And also, such a loss would be a tremendous blow to the already fragile egos of European powers devastated by World War I. Colonial powers also feared that most colonial peoples were not ready for democratic self-government and would descend into chaos if allowed to manage their own affairs. And the resulting global turmoil would threaten the fragile peace after World War I and destabilize the world economy just as it was trying to get back on its feet after the war. The United States was certainly not immune to the social and political upheavals ravaging the globe at the conclusion of World War I. For starters, the Spanish flu epidemic swept the world in 1918, and America was no exception to that. This was a period that was eerily similar to our current experience with the COVID-19 pandemic. During the Spanish flu epidemic between 1918 and 1919, about 675,000 Americans died from the virus, and over 50 million contracted the virus. And this situation itself went a long way to destabilize, to a considerable degree, American society, and particularly the American economy. At the conclusion of World War I, labor unions in the United States found hope from the ideals of the Russian Revolution and from Wilson's wartime rhetoric of freedom and democracy for all. And labor unions began to initiate even greater pushes for workers' rights in the United States. And the question became for many of these workers in these labor unions, why fight for freedom abroad if not entirely free at home? Now, this wave of labor strikes were met by an unprecedented mobilization of employers, the government, and private patriotic organizations that sought to counter this upsurge in labor activity, mainly due to fears that if allowed to fester and to spread even further, that it might inspire a communist revolution right here in the United States. The most significant labor unrest in the United States in this period was the Great Steel Strike of 1919, when steel workers went on strike and demanded for union recognition, higher wages, and an 8-hour workday. Employers responded through an appeal to an anti-immigrant sentiment, through a propaganda campaign that associates strikers with the international workers of the world and communism, which turned public opinion against the strikers. If you recall, the international workers of the world were the most communistic of all the labor unions, as they were the ones who advocated for a workers' revolution and a workers' overthrow of the government. The precise tenets of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. Due to this propaganda campaign and the turn of public opinion against the strikers, coupled with crackdowns by local and federal government on the strikers, the strike collapsed in early 1920. mainly due to the growing fear of communism that spread throughout the United States at the conclusion of World War I. The wartime repression of dissent continued after the war. This led to what was known as the Red Scare of 1919 and 1920, and this was inspired by the wave of strikes ravaging the country in 1919 and the fears generated by the communist Russian Revolution. The government raided offices of radical and labor organizations around the country, arrested thousands, many times without search warrants, many times holding people without bail. They also deported hundreds of immigrants, all who were associated with communist organizations or communist ideologies. Now, the government repression of these organizations collapsed after congressional criticism of the abuses of civil liberties associated with these raids, but essentially the damage had been done, and it was a severe setback to radical and labor organizations for decades to come. The Red Scare also kindled an identification of patriotism with support for the political and economic status quo, and anything that even hinted at communism was deemed not only unpatriotic but even treasonous. In 1919, President Woodrow Wilson went to the peace conference at Versailles, just outside of Paris, with high hopes that European leaders would embrace his idealistic 14 points. And while the resulting Treaty of Versailles did accomplish some of Wilson's goals, including the creation of the League of Nations and the application of the idea of self-determination to Eastern Europe, which was, the map there was redrawn to reflect more ethnic national boundaries. However, Britain and France proved to be tough negotiators and were not as open to many of Wilson's more idealistic tenets of his 14 points, that, or at least not as much as Wilson had hoped. And they demanded that Germany be punished for starting the war. France and Britain in particular placed all of the blame for the war on Germany. And the resulting document overall was a harsh document that all but guaranteed future conflict in Europe, particularly over the imposition of reparations on the German government at the conclusion of the war, whose payments were massive, that greatly hindered the ability of the German economy to really get back on its feet after the end of the war, because of the massive payments they had to make to Britain and France in reparations for their causing the war in the British and French eyes. Now, the ideals of Wilson could not be contained, however, and this period has been dubbed by some historians as the Wilsonian Moment, as the spread of some of Wilson's ideals, especially self-determination for colonial peoples seeking independence, went around the globe, much to the chagrin of many European powers at the time. Ideas are not so easily contained, and some of the ideas, along with self-determination, that many peoples, especially colonial peoples, latched onto was Wilson's idea of the equality of all nations. No matter how big or small, they would be equals in the eyes of the world. And also the idea of settling international disputes peacefully and avoiding the sorts of devastating conflicts that the world had just went through. And of course, that he envisioned being accomplished through the League of Nations, which, would establish a body where nations could come together to negotiate their differences diplomatically and peacefully. Of course, neither the French nor the British had any intention of applying any of these principles to their own empires. To many, a disappointing aftermath of the war is especially Wilson's inability to secure most of the tenets of his 14 points, coupled with European colonial powers' unwillingness to extend the concept of self-determination to colonial peoples and allow them to achieve independence, led to a pervasive cynicism about the Western use of the language of freedom and democracy. And resultingly, popular protest movements erupted around the world, along with a rise of anti-Western nationalism, particularly among colonial peoples. In many ways, including this unwillingness to recognize self-determination, as well as the punishment inflicted by Britain and France through the Treaty of Versailles on the German people, sowed the seeds of wars to come in the 20th century. Now, in the United States, the debate over the Versailles Treaty reached a head very quickly, and many Americans, including many American congressmen at the time, feared that the League of Nations, in particular, that part of the Treaty of Versailles, signaled an open-ended involvement in foreign affairs and infringed upon U.S. independence of action on the world stage. Many Americans saw that becoming a part of this League of Nations tied Americans' hands and made them essentially at the beck and call of other powers, especially European powers, when it came to international issues and international relations. And the Senate ultimately rejected the Versailles Treaty over the issue of the League of Nations. Now, although in the aftermath of World War I, the United States in general retreated from international involvement in the short term, it really kind of looked inward on itself and balked at any sort of international involvement, especially in Europe. Wilson's combination of idealism and power politics did create a new model for 20th century American international relations, particularly after the next Great War, World War II. In 1919, Woodrow Wilson suffered a stroke, a debilitating stroke that left him incapacitated for the remainder of his presidency. Now, this was kept secret from the American people, and his wife, Edith, essentially took his place for the last 18 months of his presidency, also something that was kept secret from the American people. And the following election, of course, Wilson did not run again, and Republican Warren G. Harding was elected in 1920 on a promise to return to normalcy after the chaos of the World War I period. That concludes the fifth and final part of our Chapter 19 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. As always, I hope you learned a lot, study hard, and I'll see you soon.